At moments like this, I always feel that about those times when I was acting and you would be 5 minutes before you were ready to go on stage and you say to yourself, I can't remember my lines. But then I remember I don't have any lines today. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about a project in which I've been involved for a number of years. And a lot of the people in this room have been involved with it, and I'll give them credit during the course of it. They've heard me talk about it. We've exchanged ideas. Some people have given me ideas that have made their way into this conversation. And I do want to begin by saying one thing, and that is that we humanists are really interesting people. Not necessarily me, but in general, because we have two kind of antithetical things for which we're responsible. We are the keeper of the flame. We are the people who maintain the tradition. We're the people who remembered what happened in Greece 1,000 or 1,500 years ago, and we preserve that, and we write about it, and we continue that tradition, and we carry it on to people. And we're also that group of people who build on that and invent new things all the time. Humanities is one of the greatest things in which you can be involved long term, because we get to combine and recombine and change and set cutting edge distinctions. And the example that I'm going to give, which is actually in some way related to this lecture, is this. These are two quotes, a little bit different from one another, one from Charles and one from Bob, separated by 100 or so years, and more or less they actually say in different contexts the same kind of thing. Okay? And I chose the Dickens quote because there are basically three things I want to talk about today that will kind of put this subject into context. So this is kind of a lecture that's a tale of two cities. The Occupy movement and the Indignados are much more than two cities, but I'm choosing two of them just to hone in on because I don't have that much time. I had asked for 5 hours, but they reserved that for somebody from Cuba. So the two cities are obviously New York and Madrid. I'm going to be talking more about Madrid. It's also a tale of one problem. There's one basic problem that both of those movements respond to, and it's also a tale of we're not exactly sure how many solutions, and we're not sure of that, and the fact that we can't figure out how many solutions there are is because the nature of the problem is so grave. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And visually, I can kind of summarize what I want to do today by this. So the question is, how does this become that? Almost overnight. And secondly, what is the relationship between that, this is New York City, Zuccotti Place, and this, the Puerta del Sol, which happened a few months before. So the question then is, where did the Occupy movement come from? Why did all those people wind up in Lower Manhattan? What were they attempting to do? And what happened to the Occupy movement? Where is it now? And to do that, I think what we need to do is to go back and look at where the Occupy movement came from. That's the Madrid part of this. And that's what we're going to do as we move past in the next few minutes. In doing so, what I'm going to do is try and shed a little bit of light on two things. One, how grassroots movements, those things that grow organically, how do grassroots movements grow organically in a digital age? What role does technology play in attempting to bring people together in acts of resistance? Now, to do that, I'm going to have to also talk a little bit, and this is now when this movement, the Humanities seminars started, there was an edict from the at that point fearless leader of all things, Humanities Week, and it consisted of 3 directives: don't read, be interesting, and talk like a real person, not an academic. Okay? And no jargon. So those were the 4 things that we were charged to do. And like good academics, we pay attention to directives from that come from above. In this case, it was doubly important. And secondly, we'll try to find ways to subvert that during the course. How many of those things can I subvert in the course of getting there? So let's go to where we are, to Zucchetti Park in Lower Manhattan. Those of you who know a lot about the history of New York will wonder, as I did, where did Zucchetti Park come from? There wasn't anything called Zucchetti Park when I was in New York. Well, because before that, it had been carved out of Lower Manhattan, right off Broadway, and at one point it was called Liberty Place, okay? And it was part of a larger piece called Liberty Plaza, I believe. Zucchetti Park, interestingly, okay, draws its name from one of the board of directors of the company that owns the park. The park is actually private property, and people have the right to use it as long as they obey the rules. And that was part of what was going to be the problem. Is if you know a lot about the history of New York City, you'll know that this was one of the ways that New York confronted a number of its perceived social problems. Privatize public spaces so you can keep out the people that you don't want to be there. And of course, the most important thing that you need to know about why Occupy Wall Street occupied Zucchetti Park is this. If you can see right here, and it's a little hard to see from where you are unless you're young, okay? Here's Zucchetti Park, right there, Lower Manhattan, right off Broadway. The World Trade Center was right here. And that is the nerve center of capitalism. That's Wall Street and the New York Stock Exchange. And since 9/11, Wall Street has actually been occupied by police. It's very difficult to get onto Wall Street unless you can prove, or to get any place near the New York Stock Exchange, you can prove you have a reason to be there. Okay? So if you were going to choose a place where you're going to make mischief about Wall Street, get as close to Wall Street as you can. And literally, the reason, as most of you probably know, that Occupy Wall Street was called Occupy Wall Street was because this was about the financial crisis of 2007. And at some point, everybody kind of began to get together and say, we need to do something public. And the and one of the things that came out of this is this wonderful book, which actually has a red cover, but it doesn't look like it there. Okay? The Occupy Handbook, this huge book that kind of began to synthesize what people thought was going on. It even has an article by Paul Volcker. He was the last one to contribute, the former director of, what was Paul Volcker the director of? The Fed, okay, the Federal Reserve Bank. So this was in the air. It was all important at that point, and literally, you always judge the importance of social movements by how much negative publicity they get in the mainstream press. This got a lot of negative publicity in the mainstream press. And it was an issue of great moment. It was an issue which a lot of people thought was going to be transformational in American society. It was an issue in which there might have been possible a kind of grassroots political movement. But as Marx said, all that is solid melts into air. And at one moment, the Occupy movement, which was, for reasons I'll explain, decided that it didn't want to get involved in mainstream politics. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that happened in a moment. Okay, so and here's where I'm going to go out on the limb and add something that is kind of quasi-intellectual, but I'm going to do it in pictures, so it won't be as bad. So, okay. The frame for this analysis comes from 3 books, all of which came out almost directly after the Occupy movement, and almost all of which engage it in some way. This one is by far the one that is most popular. Okay, and if I were going to choose a book that my colleagues would use in classes to explain social movements, this is it. Manuel Castells is one of the most cited of social scientists. He's written a gazillion million books. He's a Spaniard, and his engagement with grassroots politics started in the 1970s when he was a student of Henri Lefebvre and Alain Touraine in France. So this is the book that came out of the experience of the Occupy movement around the world, and it has a chapter called Spain, the 15M, Spain, a Rhizomatic Revolution. It's a chapter I'll talk a little bit about today. Now, two books that you may not be as familiar with, okay, are David Harvey's Rebel Cities, which came out the same year as Castells' book, and Andy Merrifield's New Urban Question. This is Merrifield, and that's Harvey. Two other social scientists. Harvey, I think, is the most widely cited social scientist in the world. Merrifield is a former student of Harvey. And these two books, taken with Castells, offer an interesting triangulation about the nature of what was going on and what it all meant. So essentially, what these books are attempting to study is a great amount of raw material. And the first is, how do grassroots movements develop and spread, especially in a time where technology has allowed people to connect in ways that they couldn't before on a much greater basis. Now, if you know something about the history of Spain, you'll know that the way that information was conveyed at a time a few years earlier about another major social protest, which was the elections that brought the socialists back to power after the Atocha bombings, that was all done on cell phones. By the time this came about, everybody had all this stuff that I kind of know in name only, like Twitter, okay, and Facebook and other forms of media, and these become extremely important. So also important are two other issues that we always need to keep in mind. One is this increased influence on rejecting politics, okay, rejecting political parties, and looking for non-hierarchical, inclusive means of direct democracy, going back to a democracy in which everybody had a voice, everybody was equal, okay? And what does that do in terms of scale if we want to embrace the concept of the commons and try to see how we can change the nature of political discourse? In addition, part of what plays into all of this is what people have called the effective turn in politics. How do we account for things like feelings and emotions, okay, in the way we make political decisions? And that's why Castells calls his book Networks of Outrage and Hope, the two antithetical emotions that are what powers these grassroots movement, the outrage at everything that was being perpetrated on people. We all know about the 99 and the 1% and how that played into this entire discourse. How Occupy itself everything became Occupy. I still am a Facebook friends, I guess, with Occupy Democrats. So I don't know why they call themselves Occupy Democrats, but I get channeled lots of information almost every day from that website. In addition, what role does public places and public space play into all of this? What about the way, the nature of how capitalism changes after 2007? And then to end, can any revolution that's only virtual actually sustain itself? Can any revolution that doesn't require, that isn't place-based, be effective over time and it scales larger than the amount of people who can fit into Zucchetti Park or the Puerta del Sol? So let's go back to Madrid and begin. Oh, wait, he said. I know a lot of my colleagues are enamored of Castells, not figuratively, of course. Okay, before you drink the Castells Kool-Aid, read this article. Okay, it's a powerful antidote, and it's written. Okay, yes, that's the same Marcuse. Okay, not this is son, the other was father. Read this article. It's really important to understand the shift in Castell's politics that I'm going to talk a little bit about in a few minutes. Right. So if we go back to Madrid, back to the Puerto del Sol on May 15th, 2011, okay, what is it that we would see? Okay, if you look at what happened in the Puerto del Sol, let me talk a little bit about what the Puerto del Sol means. Okay, for those of you who are not Hispanists, the Puerto del Sol is literally in the middle of the center of Madrid. In terms of centralist discourse, in terms of a hierarchical country, there is one thing in the Puerto del Sol that explains it all. If you go to the front of this building, right here, the Comunidad de Madrid, which used to be the Dirección General de Seguridad, that was where they took all the prisoners during the Francoist period, there's a little plaque. And the little plaque says kilometer zero. Okay? And it's from that point that all mileage in Spain is measured. Okay? That is the definition of what a centralist government is, and that's what Spain was for a long time, and that's what this movement once again began to attempt to undermine. The Puerto del Sol, therefore, is a symbolic space. It's a place where everybody always went to protest or to celebrate anything. It's where you go on New Year's Eve and try and eat 12 grapes before the bell tower tolls 12 times. It's where almost every major event in Spain has been celebrated. Curiously, importantly, it's the place where the executions took place that are made famous by Goya's paintings, right? About the 2 de Mayo, right? Now, the context for this, however, is that in Spain, people were beginning to become excruciatingly fed up for a variety of reasons I'm going to point out in a couple of minutes about what happened after 2007 and the effects on their lives. And there were two people who helped galvanize the nature of this kind of implicit resistance. The first is Stéphane Hessel, French, very, very interesting French intellectual. This gentleman over here is José Luis San Pedro, a Spanish intellectual. Curiously, they were born in the same year, 1917. Okay? Hessel was a member of the French resistance, and he was at the time that he wrote this book, this is the translation, Indignados, which was a call to the youth in Spain to rise up against the conditions that had been put in place by non-representative kinds of representative government. At that point, he was the last living signatory of the 1948 Rome Declaration of Human Rights. San Pedro had an equally distinguished career. San Pedro some people look to Hessel's work, some people look to San Pedro's as the father of this movement of indignation. So what exactly was generating the indignation? First and foremost, it was the collapse of the financial markets. Okay? It was a collapse of the financial markets exacerbated by the call from the European community that in order to fight this problem, that Spain enact laws of austerity. Very difficult laws of austerity. The problem at this point, however, of course, was that the government in power was a center leftist government, the Socialist Party, and they were the ones charged with getting these laws enacted, and they would pay a huge political price for it. Okay? So essentially what happens is that there's a perceived failure in the nature of the political system, especially the two-party system which had governed Spain since the restoration of democracy. Now, you know, like most European countries, Spain is not a two-party system, system like we are, but essentially there were 2.5 major parties. There's the Partido Popular, which is the right-wing party, and there's the Socialist Party, which was this leftist party, which is more now left of center, and then there was the Izquierda Unida. And none of these parties seem to be providing people with the answers, or at least the protection that they wanted. So between the austerity, the economic collapse, and the cuts in public funding, and most of all, I think what really got people's goat, it was the victimology. It was blaming the victims for the issues. An example that I can give you that comes out of the New York context is the Giuliani administration's looking at homelessness as the cause of New York's problem, okay, when actually it was the effect of poor governmental management. And the same thing was going on in Spain, and people were getting more and more upset, and there'd be a big manifestation, and the usual suspects would show up, and then at the next one there'd be the usual suspects plus one, and there'd be usual suspects plus two, and the usual suspect, and the manifestations just kept getting bigger and bigger, fueled also by the fact that there was Spain had a huge issue with mortgages. The mortgage laws in Spain are just about the most cruel hoax foisted on normal people in the entire world. So if you default, if you go into bankruptcy in Spain, if you lose your house, the bank takes your house, and you're still liable to pay for it. Yeah. I think Chase is working on something similar here, but they haven't gotten to that point yet, thank God. So these are some of the things that were going on, and there was something called the Plataforma de Afectados por la Hipoteca, a huge group of people who were beginning to protest about their fate with mortgages. So there'd be a call for movement, and more people would show up, and then all of a sudden, on the 15th of May, I know because I was sitting in a cafe talking to an artist and his wife about a project, and she was a photographer, and she got a text, and the text said, "We're all going to Seoul," and it was May 15th. Okay? And lots of people helped plan the rally on May 15th. But what lots of people did not expect was everybody that would show up. And not only that everybody would show up, but that lots of people would want to stay. So the question is, what happens when the manifestation, okay, becomes an Occupy movement? It becomes the Indignados staying in Spain. Now, of course, there were two other things that just made people really mad. One was that there had been a law proposed about managing the internet called the Ley Cinde, okay? And as it turned out, they invited a lot of people to a meeting where they were going to discuss it, and one of the people they invited turned out to be the wrong person. He wasn't supposed to be on the list. And then he made public what happened, which was the two parties said, this is the law we're going to pass, we're going to propose it tomorrow, we'll all vote without any discussion. And the fact that these groups, these autonomous groups, were feeling terribly disaffected because the mainstream media, as is the case here, mainstream media needs somebody who they think is a spokesperson, who's speaking for everybody. And when they can't find one, they don't know how to tell the story. And the problem with all of these horizontal kind of non-hierarchical movements was they didn't know who to talk to. So when the groups would approach them, their stories would not get out. And all of this played into this intense desire to make a difference, to change something now. And if you want, this is just the best explanation of the financial crisis in Spain is this book, Españistan, by a gentleman named Alex Saló. That's the YouTube video below. If you want 6 minutes of very young, outrageous explanation of the financial crisis, this will do it for you. It'll explain everything in 6 minutes. And I thank Raul, my graduate student, for finding this piece of information for me. Anytime I need a laugh, anytime this subject gets too difficult to deal with, I just watch that video again. It'll really do it for you. And then all of a sudden, there was a Spanish Revolution. Hashtag Spanish Revolution. There was something called hashtag 15M. There was something called the Indignados, and they were occupying the prime real estate in Madrid and a lot of other cities as well. As I said, I'm only concentrating on Madrid here. All of a sudden, all these people were in the streets. There was panic. Okay? There was panic on the parts of the people in power. There was panic on the parts of the socialists, because the socialists didn't want to do anything that would make them seem like they were the forces of public order under the Franco regime. So they didn't want to move the people out, okay? But they were getting a lot of pushback from the Partido Popular, who was hoping to manage this entire thing into winning the next elections, right? And you can see the nature of what this discourse looked like in here. This is Democracia Real Ya, which was one of those movements that began on the internet, which was the way people began to connect with each other. Toma la calle, take back the street, take back the square. Okay, and these were two of them that these signs that you would see all over Madrid, and especially during the manifestations. So, and then the other was this one. This is a whole group of signs for a group that began as a Twitter account called Don't Vote for Them, okay? And what this meant was vote out, don't vote, don't participate in the political party, voting for one of the two main parties. And you can see here, this one actually does it extremely well because it puts together the symbolism for the PP and the socialists. There is a huge problem, okay, of critical distance. At a certain level of abstraction, okay, when you step back, there is a huge difference in Spanish history between governments run by the socialists and governments run by right-wing parties. When you get down on the street, for the people at that moment, it didn't look that way. Unfortunately, the inability by these movements to step back later was going to have disastrous consequences that I'll talk about at the end of this lecture. All right? So at some point, what happens is people stay. Okay? And when people stay, the nature of the relationship between groups and individuals and the nature of what's going on has to necessarily change. Because if you're the mother of 5, okay, and you go to the Puerta del Sol to protest, you can't stay there for 3 weeks, okay? But what happens then is that literally the Puerta del Sol becomes a mini representation of a non-hierarchical direct democracy. And it functions as a non-hierarchical miniature direct democracy because it's only a limited amount of space with a limited amount of people, all of whom could go to these councils and talk over every issue for hours and come to a consensus. Right? But they couldn't stay there forever, and eventually people were going to leave the Puerta del Sol. Okay? But what we do know is that the people who stayed were mostly younger. Most of them were people who had leftist-leaning ideologies. Almost all of them were from urban centers. And almost all, this is the interesting thing, this is where social scientists actually help us a little bit from time to time. Almost, if you map the internet chatter in every form about the nature of what was going on in the Puerta del Sol or in the Plaza de Catalunya or in other places around Spain, almost all of that internet chatter emanated from cities. So what you had reproduced was an urban-rural divide, which had always been behind, well, we know all about that here, okay? There's Baja Arizona, and then there's the rest of the state. So I don't have to tell you more about how that works, okay? And of course, I came across this directly, okay? Because at one point, Juliana Luna Freire, who was one of my graduate students at that point, we were working on this virtual reality project. And we were mapping spaces in Hispanic parts of the world that had virtual representations. We'd built our own, okay? And she walked in the office and said, "Do you know what the Indignados are?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I just talked to 4 of them. And they want to occupy our space," okay? And I said, "Okay, let's talk to them." So we went out there and we talked to them. And since I had a long tradition of working with the Ocupa movement, which took place in Spain in the 90s, I thought they wanted to occupy one of our buildings. So I started this long conversation with these people. I have no idea what part of the world they're actually in. We're talking, and they say, "No, we want to occupy, we don't need a building, we want a public space." I said, "Okay, come on in. We'll give you part of the public space. You can see that there are people here. Some of those signs, they look familiar because they're exactly the same ones." What I didn't do is they gave me a T-shirt. I should have had the T-shirt reproduced to do the lecture today, but I completely forgot it. I do have the signs, okay? And this is another one talking about what they wanted to do. And I said, "There's only one condition, being a professor. You have to come and talk to my graduate class." So at one point, I'm sitting at the front of the class, and I've got this class full of graduate students, half of whom are Spaniards, and they've got the chance to interact with all of these people. This is October after the May Revolution, and all I could see was the screen, okay, the chat below, and everybody's hands going like this as they're trying to get all their questions answered. Some of them are sitting in this room, and I don't know how they type that fast, but because the conversation was really interesting, because it revolved around one thing, and the one thing was, what are you going to do now? Are you going to participate in the political process? Are you going to form a party? Who are you going to vote for? And the answer, and this is extremely important, is the answer was no. We are not going to participate in the political party. We don't believe in the political system as it now exists, and we are going to abstain. We're not going to do anything, okay? Because we have no control over what anybody does. We, these 3 people that we were talking to, are going to abstain, and we hope that everybody else does, okay? So then the question is, okay, after the Indignados leave the Puerta del Sol, what happened, okay? And what happened is tremendously important. From Castell's point of view, and this is where the history is really important, and I'm not going to get into a lot of this, but I will if anybody asks me about it. Castells came from a background of being disenchanted with mainstream leftist politics, with the collapse of what he called collective consumption, the welfare state. When people stopped investing in that, when leftist parties, he believed, were going the wrong way, he backed off. And that's why he saw in the Indignados something that for him was truly interesting. Okay? It was people getting together to try and solve a problem. And as he said it, individuals make ideology, instead of ideology making movements of resistance. So for him, the idea of congealing around a specific ideology was not what he thought should happen. And if you read that article, which was published in 2012, he brushes off the results of the 2012 elections. Because what happened when all of these people who had actually galvanized support, decided to not vote or to vote for non-mainstream parties. Spain, to do this, I'm going to use an analogy. This was the equivalent of Spaniards embracing Fernando el Deseado, Fernando VII in the 19th century as el Deseado. This brought in 2-3 years of extremely aberrant right-wing government, which was even more aberrant than every other time the Pepe had governed in Spain, because they had the opposition had literally collapsed. The main opposition, the socialists, were in shambles. Okay, Harvey, for his part, okay, weighed in this way. These are two quotes which I think are crucial. Okay, because they highlight two things, and they both have to do with discourse. The first is that the best way to hide your ideology is to get people to talk about something which is not germane. And the second is what we do, I've been harping on this for years in academia, we solve lots of problems, but most of them, they're the result of asking the wrong questions. When you actually step back and say, time out, is that what we should be really asking? Is how did we get to the point where we think that taxes are too high when taxes are at the lowest point in the United States in any time in the last 100 years? How did that happen? Where did that discursive move take place? Okay? And then what happens? What happens is all of a sudden, after a year, part of the Indignado movement resurfaces as part of a non-mainstream party called Podemos. And you can see it right here, okay? Because this is Pablo Iglesias, who is the leader of the Podemos grouping, because they don't want to call themselves a party, okay? And the gentleman to his right, okay, was one of the main architects of the 15M. Between them, before they had a falling out, they began to form a political organization. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute, what happened to Castells and their ideas of not forming political organizations? Well, what happened was at some point, there was enough of an impetus for people to try and form a party that went beyond the two-party system. And in point of fact, the Podemos party, or non-party, okay, the support that it gave to different organizations began to have an effect in the municipal elections, okay, in Spain that were held last summer, May, June, July, sometime in the summer, okay? May, okay? And what happened was there were leftist mayors elected in both Madrid and Barcelona, okay? And those mayors had ties in one way or another to the Indignado movement. Curiously, if you go back and you look at history, that's exactly how the socialists, okay, who were the anathema for Podemos, came to power in 1979 when they won the municipal elections that would catapult them to an absolute majority in the 1982 general elections. And who's at the center of this? Manuel Castells. Because Castells had been the darling of the Spanish left in the 1970s. It was his work on the grassroots movements, okay, that had actually began to allow people, at a time when political parties were not allowed in Spain, began to allow people to, through the neighborhood associations, not the kind of neighborhood associations we're used to with gated communities and things, but the neighborhood associations began to take the place of political parties. Then all of a sudden there was democracy, and Castells began to go in other directions. So if you follow Castells' route, it goes from the grassroots to networks, from working with people to talking abstractly about how organizations work. All of a sudden, okay, last year, who begins to become the darling of Podemos? Manuel Castells, okay, who, one, had said that there shouldn't be a political party, that the Indignados should never form a political party, and two, who then said that he was going to rewrite the chapter in his book on the Indignados because maybe he got it wrong, okay, and maybe things were going in a different direction. I remain ever hopeful, okay, that people will be able to take back the streets, to take back public places. Remember, as Don Mitchell says, there is no such thing as public space. Public space is negotiated, and it is it becomes public through the uses to which one gives it. Okay, and I remain ever hopeful that, you know, at some point everybody is going to wake up from this creative amnesia and says, what the hell were we thinking? Get those guys out of there. Okay, and that's what I'm going to lead, because I hope that's where we'll be in a few months here as well. Thanks very much.